So here's a question nobody asks. What do you do when one of your oldest friends is Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the former president of Estonia, a European Union nation? I'll tell you what you do. You call him. A lot. My name's Andy Valver. I'm a comedian, American-born, now living in Europe because, well, if you could, wouldn't you? I grew up in the U.S., hearing stories from my parents about a country that didn't exist. At least not on any map you could buy because the Soviets had wiped it out. I only had one buddy who understood, Toomas. His parents were also Estonian, also refugees, and Toomas and I grew up sharing the same traditions, same weird Estonian Saturday school, and same conviction that America and Europe were family. And for most of our lives, they were. The alliance held until it didn't. Right now, the relationship that defined the free world for 80 years is coming apart, and Europe is scrambling to figure out who it is and what comes next. Toomas and I talk about this stuff, and it seems selfish to keep these conversations to myself. So here it is, the Continental Rift, with former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves and me, Andy Valver. Serious politics, questionable hosts. Hey, Toomas.
How are you?
Good. Are you wearing Raiffeisen-related? Are you wearing Estonian folk costume?
To be honest, yes, because I'm about to go, after we finish recording this, to open one of the biggest folk festivals in Northern Europe, which takes place some 40 kilometers from where I am right now. And I've been opening it every year since somewhere in the mid-90s.
Are you wearing white knee socks with the sort of knee-length pants too?
No. Down here, where we're from, we don't.
You don't do that.
Have those things. No, we have the.
You got lucky.
This was the more prosperous area of Estonia back when these things were.
So people had enough material for long pants.
Yes. And shoes.
And shoes, right. Well, see, when I was 11 and growing up, my mom put the folk costume on the bed on a Sunday when we were going to Estonian school. And she goes, put that on. And I took one look at it and I went, there was no way I'm leaving the house dressed like that. Okay. And my mom goes, well, you better put it on. Otherwise, you're staying in your room all day. So anyway, this is the Continental Rift. It is July 23rd. A lot is going on. We're going to talk about the Dragi Report. We're going to talk about the Ukraine defense shakeup. We're going to talk about European sanctions being held up by a Greek. But first of all, the big breaking story apparently is the Europeans have decided to fine Google in a big way. Basically, Europe wants Google to play by European rules. Trump wants Europe to play by American rules. Google just wants everybody to click accept all cookies.
Essentially, yes. You put it pretty well. But it really comes down to, in this case, and earlier ones too, which is that Google shows preferences for its own apps when you do a Google search. And that is something which would be, even in the United States in earlier days, would have been considered an antitrust violation. That is, if you have one service, so you do Google search, all the options that come out of that search should be kind of on an equal basis. And they have determined that no, it gives preferences to Google's own other services. Basically, that's what it is.
Okay.
Now, and that's classical antitrust material. In the United States, 120 years ago, they broke up Standard Oil because of antitrust action. So, of course, antitrust actions have been coming ever since then. But under the current circumstances, it's the European Union apparently today about to put a fine on Google for abusing its preferences and privileges. And this comes at a very nasty time in terms of the rift, because at the same time, the United States is considering slapping on new tariffs after the Trump tariffs from last year were ruled by the Supreme Court as being improper, if not unconstitutional or illegal. That means that we have two decisions going on at the same time. One is the EU action on Google, which has caused already U.S. lawmakers to get all angry, and then the imposition of new tariffs on the part of the U.S., which might be sort of influenced, probably will be influenced by whatever decision is made by the European Union.
Okay, so but the fines are big, right? I mean, they're talking billions of dollars.
And they're for Google, which has some 100 billion cash just like lying around.
That's like Sergey Brin going, let's see, I think I've got that in my brown slacks hanging in my closet.
Well, more or less. On the other hand, it is this is a matter of principle, and so we'll see.
All right, but so Trump responding to this, will that be an emotional response? I cracked him up. I'm ahead of the game.
Yes. Well, but there's a lot more going on because this is something we don't know about yet. Another thing we don't know quite about yet, which is coming up, which we have been discussing now for a couple of times, is the sanctions package, which the 21st sanctions package, which has been postponed and delayed. And it really comes down to basically Greek ships.
Right. Sanctions against Russia, basically.
Yes. Well, these sanctions are about, yes, Russia. And there are a number of issues here. It seems that after Orban was defeated, and he managed to always block things, that the fig leaf has come off the other countries' self-interest, because everyone could always blame Orban. But now they can't blame Orban. They can't blame Hungary. And so now this sanctions package has found objections from all kinds of them. The most important one being the Greek government standing up for its Greek tycoon that delivers a lot of the liquefied natural gas from Russia to the world, saying that this is going to cause too much economic damage if you sanction them. Of course, there's another one, which is Austria, which defending its Raiffeisen-Bank, because they stayed in Russia after 2022. Not only they stay there, they even actually offered loans to soldiers fighting in Ukraine, which was kind of tasteless, I would say, and morally reprehensible. But the point is that Austria is demanding that Raiffeisen-Bank be compensated. Then a third issue there is the issue of visas for Russian soldiers. All of the northern countries have come out saying, look, we don't want these guys who have been raping, killing, torturing, coming into the European Union. And the French and the Italians and I think the Spanish are saying, no, but we need the
tourist dollars.
But the top issue is the one on the Greek LNG tank.
So let me get this straight. The EU spent 3 years trying to cripple the Russian economy, and it turns out that the whole thing can be stopped by one Greek billionaire with a few ice-breaking LNG tankers. You know, somewhere in the Kremlin, they're thinking, why didn't we think of that?
The issue is that this is a ramp up. So he was not sanctioned earlier, but the level of sanctions keep going up to a higher level. We don't know at this point what the decision will be. Last week, they met for basically 3 days straight with the Greeks still blocking. If they don't come up with a sanctions package today, that means that there would be big problems.
Well, everybody goes on vacation.
Yes, that precisely. Today is the last day of business, and that's why both news issues have come up. Both the issue of the fine on Google and the sanctions. Today, it's make or break. Well, it's not just the EU. I mean, you have the same issue in the U.S. Congress. Everyone goes on vacation.
So this is the equivalent of basically putting some dog poo in a bag, lighting it on fire, leaving it on someone's doorstep, ringing the bell, and running away.
More or less. Well, I guess you could kind of go back to your childhood habits here.
I didn't do that, but that was a well-known trick in the neighborhood. So, but basically, they're just kicking the can down the road.
Well, they don't want to. They don't want to because the implications of kicking the can down the road, at least on the case of the sanctions, are enormous because each sanctions package, they have to renew the cap on the price of Russian oil. Otherwise, the price of oil could just shoot up, in which case Russia would get a lot more money. So all of this is going on right now today. But as we record, we don't have the final decision yet.
The other big issue, which I mentioned, which of course was the Ukraine defense shakeup that's been going on all week long. I mean, Ukraine has gone through defense ministers and army chiefs faster than Chelsea goes through football managers.
Well, not quite. Not quite.
Okay, so it's not Chelsea football metaphor, but what did happen?
As is basic practice in democratic governments, you have a head of the military, usually, a high-ranking general, and then you have a civilian who is Minister of Defense. In commie countries, you usually have a general as Minister of Defense, but that's a different matter. In any case, last week, President Zelensky fired the civilian Fedorov, who was the Minister of Defense, who was renowned for his innovation. He's really the drone revolution that we have seen in the past half year is really his doing. He came over from being the Minister of Digitization. He's brought in a huge amount of innovation and adtech into the military in the war against Russia, and he was fired.
From what I've read, there was protests about him being fired. He's a good guy. Okay.
Well, I'll get there. Don't run ahead of me.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the reason for this was a conflict with an old Soviet-style general, Syrsky, who had basically he was trained in the Soviet system, and so they've had a conflict ever since the minister Fedorov came in, and finally Zelensky fired Fedorov in basically choosing sides in favor of the old Soviet-style general, which led to protests all over Ukraine, 6 days of street protests. Which to me shows the strength of Ukrainian society, where people come out and protest in favor of a good minister. And then after 6 days of the protests, Zelensky relented and instead fired the old Soviet-style general and brought in a much younger, 20 years younger general who was kind of considered a hero anyway because of his courageous actions over the years since the war started. And so now, at least it shows that public pressure in a country like Ukraine works like it does anywhere else.
All right, but I don't understand. Okay, I mean, the talk in military circles is how successful this whole drone thing has been. I mean, they are now the world leaders in terms of drone warfare. I mean, they've been sending drones all the way to St. Petersburg to destroy oil refineries. They should actually send drones up to the Yamal LNG project, destroy that, and that way we won't need the Greek tankers. That's beside the point.
It's a little far away, but no.
But I don't understand why get rid of him. Why?
Well, this is the kind of still somewhat Byzantine politics of leadership in Ukraine today.
All right. So do you think that European leaders got on the phone with Zelensky, the people that are donating the money, and going, listen, this is not a good move?
Well, countries don't interfere like that, but they do. They do let it be known that, well, This is, well,
So it's a little more subtle than that, but their displeasure was noted. Let's move on to the next topic. The Draghi Report is sort of looming. It was released in September of 2024 and is basically a blueprint for making Europe competitive again. It was written by the former Italian Prime Minister and former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi. It argues that Europe is falling behind the United States in technology and China in manufacturing because it invests too little, innovates too slowly, and is held back by fragmented markets and cumbersome decision-making. And Draghi warned that unless Europe acts together and starts investing hundreds of billions of euros a year in innovation, energy, defense, and digital technology, it risks long-term economic decline and losing its geopolitical influence. Basically, Europe spent decades asking itself, why are we not more competitive? And the answer was, of course, 400 pages long. So, as I understand it, Mario Draghi wrote 383 recommendations.
Yes.
Europe has implemented about 60.
More or less.
So Europe basically read the executive summary.
If they did.
And it was written by an Italian. So if anyone knows about slow growth, bureaucracy, and governments that struggle to get things done.
Well, let's not get into national stereotypes here. Let me try to bring it up to date. The problem with the European Union, of which there are many problems, but what we see happening is that the United States in the past 20 years has pulled ahead of Europe in growth. And meanwhile, in China, the other very big economy, those are the top three, EU, United States, China, has been taking off in manufacturing. So, just massively producing things. And the effects of this are the following, that the countries of the European Union's manufacturing base is being hollowed out, much in the way we saw happen in the United States 15, 20 years ago, which led to Trump. And of course, the United States, with its heavy emphasis on tech, especially when it comes to AI, is also pulling ahead. The GDP per capita differences between the United States and Europe, at least on paper, look immense. You have to take into account that, when you look at GDP per capita, it's an average. It does not mean that Europeans are, as the MAGA folks like to say, are Euro poors. It's actually that in Europe, the differences between the rich and the poor are much smaller, and you don't have a huge amount of wealth held by a very small number of people. But the Draghi report is actually very serious in that he looks at the fundamental problems that Europe has been facing and that Europe has not wanted to deal with. And the reason why Europe has not dealt with this really comes down to one basic issue, which comes down to the veto. In Europe, on critical issues, as we saw earlier when we were discussing the sanctions, but on foreign policy and also fiscal policy and tax policy, one country can veto actions. Be it in sanctions or now, as with fundamental reforms, Europe needs to get rid of its unanimity rule. But the problem is that it's a catch-22, because in order to get rid of the unanimity rule, you need unanimous consent.
Unanimous consent. So it's catch-22.
Right. Nonetheless, what Draghi raises, and this has become even more salient and important in the past 2 years since he presented this report, is the AI revolution. The US and China are pulling massively ahead of the Europeans when it comes to AI. The amount of investment in AI in Europe is minuscule. Now, what this comes down to are all kinds of related financial issues, financial instruments. For example, the absence of a unified capital market in Europe. What that means is that we have 27 member states. Each one of them has its own capital market, which means that they don't get money in from outside because all of them are considered too small. And it also means that the ability to invest in projects is much more limited.
But they're trying to fix that, right?
Fortunately, that's an area that has the usual kind of voting procedure in the European Union called QMV, which stands for qualified majority voting, which means you need 55% of the countries representing 65% of the population of the EU. So that looks like that's coming. There should be a huge boost to Europe, because if you have a single capital market, suddenly a lot of money that otherwise has been going to, for example, the United States, would suddenly be pouring into the European Union, because, well, it's probably a better investment at this time, given the spreads on T-bonds in the United States. I don't want to get too technical.
No. But we do have the money, right? Europe does have the money.
No, we don't have we would get the money for, investment from outside and also from inside if we had a single capital market. It's not simply the absence of money. It's also investment into all kinds of different things. And it has to do with the revitalization of industry, because investment in industry has been a chronic problem in the European Union. Another issue which is really big for AI is the fact that energy is completely sort of fractured in the European Union. You really need a single energy market, which would bring down energy costs. Europe is also plagued by the problem of the highest energy costs in the world.
Let me ask you something very quickly. One of the key Draghi Report recommendations was stop treating climate policy and industrial policy as enemies.
Well, yeah. Climate policy is, that's a real political football, and that needs to be addressed. The European Union has passed a huge amounts of regulations on for the noble end of reducing carbon emissions. However, the way they've done it, which is one of the drawbacks of the European Union, is that they do it through massive amounts of regulations, causing companies to have to produce all kinds of paperwork these days, and which slows down growth. Industrial policy is more of an ideological thing. They say the government shouldn't set industrial policy. We shouldn't be deciding where the money goes. Rather, let the companies do it themselves. That's been traditionally the view of the United States, but especially under the Trump administration, you see the U.S. government buying shares in all kinds of companies, tech companies. And this is something which I think there will be less objections to. A final thing that really needs to be done is something called the single market, which went through huge reforms in terms of goods 30 years ago. 35 years ago, which meant that you could ship goods from any point in the EU to another point in the EU without having to go through all kinds of tariff barriers or having customs and so forth. And that was absolutely vital for the EU to become a single economic unit and make it a trade bloc.
Right.
And it works for goods, and that's one of the points where you get all kinds of silly comments from people in the old days, largely from the UK, but also you still from the US about this bureaucracy. Well, if you want to sell your lawnmower made in Spain and want to ship it up to Sweden, then you better follow the same standards because otherwise it won't work. However, they have consistently fought having this apply to services. And every country, well, a lot of countries strictly regulate services, which means that if you are a baker from France and you want to go be a baker in Germany, you basically can't do that because the German government says, well, in order to be a baker here, you have to pass this test.
That is so German.
And it's only in the German language. Banking is another one, obviously, where, lots of countries don't want foreign banks coming in and offering services at a cheaper rate. And here the smaller countries are completely opposed because obviously banks in smaller countries are smaller banks, and it's tough to compete with, say, a big German bank.
So Draghi suggested a minimum of 750 to 800 billion euros in additional investment every year. I mean, that's like 4.5% of Europe's GDP. I mean, just to compare, the Marshall Plan ran 1% to 2% of GDP a year, and that rebuilt Europe, a whole continent.
Well, that was 1% to 2% of U.S. GDP. One of the best investments they ever made, by the way.
Yes, I totally agree.
Okay. Secondly, it was not a whole continent. It was only Western Europe. So we're dealing with a much smaller group that got that amount of money. Recalling, of course, that much of what is the U.S. tech industry today was originally funded by the U.S. government.
Yes, I remember that because the whole internet thing, the whole thing was DARPA. That's where it came out
Right.
of.
Yes. I mean, while the sums that Draghi talks about seem immense, they are, in a sense, represent the amount of money that Europe did not spend in the past 30 years on industrial development. Since George Herbert Walker Bush, that's George Bush the first, declared the peace dividend, the amount of money spent by Europe on any kind of defense industry and anything related to that went down dramatically. I mean, in many ways, this is the cost of lack of building up your industry. That's point one. Point two is...
What did we spend it on? Silly things like healthcare and high-speed rail?
No, we just didn't spend it. And also, high-speed rail is
We
not...
saved our little pennies and put them in a bank.
But this gets to the last and maybe other really major sticky point of the Draghi report, which is that, yes, this amount of money that's needed is huge. The amount of money that the European Union could borrow if it did it as the European Union is also huge. I mean, just again, to think of the United States and the U.S., I mean, it is borrowed through its treasury bills or bonds. It's enormous. It is highly indebted. The European Union is not indebted at all, essentially, as the EU. Individual countries may be quite indebted, but as the EU would have enormous borrowing power at low interest rates, and they could just take huge amounts of money and pump it into all of these areas that Draghi reports about. But the problem is that certain countries, France, Italy, if you remember back in the 2000, Greece, borrowed then and have continued to borrow huge amounts of money, and they're deeply in debt. Whereas the countries in Northern Europe, including our own, Estonia, have borrowed very little. In fact, Estonia has the lowest debt of any country in the European Union. But basically, you have these countries called the Frugals, and that's basically the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Denmark are against common borrowing. How we get over that, I don't know. But basically, that is the other key to getting the funds that Draghi rightfully calculates in his massive report.
The Frugals, that sounds like some sort of a cartoon show, like the Muppets.
Well, it's either that or it's a punk band.
Is there a coalition of the Draghi willing? I mean, there are people who want to implement this stuff,
yes.
Right? And
okay, you have to understand, there are all of the countries of the EU are for some aspect of the Draghi report. All of the countries in the EU are against other aspects. And they don't overlap. Everyone picks their cherries. And so you have little countries are against a banking union, as I mentioned before. Big countries are for it.
right.
I mean, when it comes to borrowing, well, France and Italy are going, yeah, we got to borrow. Whereas
Right.
the Germans say, no,
right.
nine.
Yeah, I'm sure the Estonians are going, what? No, we don't want to borrow money. I mean, this goes back to my parents. They go, no. No borrowing. I do have a question, which I meant to ask earlier. Why doesn't Europe create some sort of a tax-free tech zone where entrepreneurs can come, work on their stuff, get some really good benefits? I mean, like Luxembourg or pick some swamp that's not being used, but make it an area that people can pump money into, create a Silicon Valley with benefits.
No, that would not work. It goes fundamentally against the principles of the European Union that everyone is the same level playing field. And so that would not work. And besides, you cannot create artificially a Silicon Valley. Or what we call Silicon Valley is an ecosystem that grew organically out of a very specific set of circumstances, which had to do with basically a lot of electronics companies in the same area as Stanford University, one of the best engineering universities in the world, and a lot of dope-smoking hippies like Steve Jobs, who have these crazy ideas and are tripping on LSD and listening to the Grateful Dead. I mean, this is a unique combination. I would highly recommend a book called What the Dormouse Said, which is about the rise of Silicon Valley because of these different influences all in one particular place. Everyone who's tried to create a Silicon Valley, most notoriously in Russia, it doesn't work. But we don't really need that. I mean, the problem is different, is that we have so many different kinds of talents in the EU, in tech, which have come up with all kinds of things. I mean, even tiny Estonia, we have 10 unicorns, right? A bunch of Estonian kids created Skype, which was for a long time the thing to use.
And Wise,
which is the main way to transfer money these days. But the problem is the whole unified capital markets thing, because I know a kid who came up with something here in Estonia, and he moved to the US. And he immediately got a whole bunch of money there because they said this is a great idea. And then he later sold his company for $150 million. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that the unified capital markets would be a solution to, that you would be able to, if you're a kid with a crazy idea in even Luxembourg, which you called a swamp.
No, I didn't say it was a swamp. I said we could pick a swamp. But I performed a lot in Luxembourg. I've always loved. They don't have banks in Luxembourg. They have what's called wealth management. I just hope to have enough unruly wealth someday that has to be managed.
Well, yeah, I guess that's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but we've made the wrong career paths.
That's for sure.
Being a comedian or being a politician in an honest country, all these people always going to be like, oh, you should be really rich. They're going like, No, we don't.
That isn't who you are.
This comes down to levels of corruption, which is another issue that actually Northern Europe is fairly good at, which is another reason why the Frugals, the punk Muppet group are against common borrowing, because they like, oh, well, I mean, we don't know what you can do.
Yeah, well, who's going to pay that? Who's going to pay that? We're going to end up paying.
Countries like Hungary, which under Orban was so corrupt that I mean, this is kind of like a secondary effect of Orban on things like the Draghi Report, because it's like, look at the Hungarians. I mean, look what they did with EU money. I mean, how can we allow this?
All right. Well, finally, is there some sort of time limit on one person, like, to have a responsibility to work on this? I mean, does von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, have a mandate to get the Draghi thing through the system?
We really have to discuss how the EU works on this issue, because basically,
well, we're going to do that over the next several shows. We're going to give a primer, but you know what? We're going to try to make it approachable and understandable.
Well, it's a tough task. On the other hand, I think a lot of the problems that we have in EU-US relations really comes from the inability or the refusal of the US government to understand how the EU works. It's not more complicated than the US, actually, but it's different. So I think our audience, even in Europe, doesn't quite understand, like, what is that? Commission, council, what the hell is that?
Right. And we're going to do that explaining. All right. Well, that's enough for this week's Continental Rift. I want to thank my co-host, the former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. I'm Andy Valver. The Continental Rift is produced by Fresh Lens Productions, and all rights are reserved. We will see you next week for another episode of the Continental Rift.